did Tehran was nasty work. It was filthy. Folks don't pay attention. They don't read. They don't investigate. They don't do their homework. You can't tell them nothing. And they get nowhere fast. And the Sahel, they still not paying attention. But they're going to learn. Assad learned. He got overrun. Had to fly to Moscow. The Ayatollah's family and several prominent folks in Tehran jumped on a plane and flew to Moscow. They had to get help. It wasn't free. They had to hand over a fair amount of gold. And as far as what to talk about who won in the 12-day conflict between Tehran and quote-unquote Tel Aviv, depends on how you look at it. It was some will say. But come on, man. Most of your launchers for your ballistic missiles get knocked out. Large swaths of your anti-aircraft batteries gone. So-called Tel Aviv and so-called DC both cracked your data links provided by Beijing. So-called Tel Aviv had air dominance. So-called DC had air supremacy. Dropped these massive ordnance. And folks talk about, oh, well, they just bombed some empty places where they used to have their nuclear operations. In Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Totally missed the point. You know darn well that back in the day, particular parties in so-called DC, when they went to go bomb Syria, they told the Russians and the Assyrians in advance, and they moved their stuff out the way. They fired 100 Tomahawk missiles, knowing full well they moved most of the aircraft off the particular airbase. It was dog and pony show. This was dog and pony show. They had long since moved a lot of stuff out of there. That wasn't the point. And folks still don't get it. The reason why those heavy ordnance bombs, they were falling in the first place, that wasn't a punch in the face to Tehran. That was a punch in the face to Beijing. Beijing got the message. A few Earth days later, they finalized the quote-unquote tariff trade deal. They got the message. Your bunkers under the influence of Beijing are not deep enough. They can still get you. So-called Tel Aviv and so-called DC both cracked your data links. They can blind you at will. They did blind you at will. So-called Tel Aviv was so cocky, they were refueling their birds, their F-35s, over Tehran's airspace because they could. So your surface-to-air missile systems provided by Beijing, ineffective, and got knocked out. That told Beijing, you got a problem. So they had a meeting of their CMC, Central Military Commission, to figure out if they go into Formosa to attack Taipei and take it over, based on what just happened between so-called Tel Aviv and Tehran, what would happen if they decide that they're going to, under the influence of Beijing, roll over almost 100 nautical miles to Formosa to attack Taipei and take it over? They got the message. That will not end well for them. Which is part of the reason as to why moves got made by the elders in the CCP against their current General Secretary. Because he wants to go in to Formosa within the next 2 Earth years. Some of his military, they're like, no. They don't want to do all that. Because they know it would not end well. They know full well if they go in, they're going to get cracked and smashed and torn to pieces. And the one who's watching very closely, New Delhi. Very closely. Another one of Beijing's default colonies, not just Tehran, the other colony, Islamabad. Most of their weapons they get from Beijing. And when they had the little dust up between New Delhi and Islamabad, it was weaponry from Beijing again. And what did folks learn? New Delhi cracked the code on a day link for Beijing also. They made the screens go dark in Islamabad. So you're in theater on your own home turf. You have no situational awareness because you've been blinded. That's not good. And when you don't have an aircraft carrier of your own, what New Delhi does, that means you can get attacked from a different theater altogether, a different angle of attack, a different position. They're hitting you from over land, and they're hitting you from the sea. And you have no means really to stop that. You've got a few submarines. They're older and not as effective as New Delhi's. I'll bring it back to the Sahel. Because what folks not paying attention to, you can say it 5 trillion times, they still don't get the connection. And there's a reason for this. In the Alkebu-lan and the Ab.Zu, Beijing, the debt trapper, spends billions in propaganda. Moscow, the arms supplier, spends billions in the Alkebu-lan and the Ab.Zu on propaganda. Most of the information available in the Alkebu-lan and the Ab.Zu is basically information that's been brokered by those that locally control the guns. And all they're feeding the local populations is propaganda from Beijing and Moscow. So they do this to gain access to weapons and finances. Weapons from the arms supplier in Moscow, finance from the debt trappers in Beijing, to get into power and stay in power. And the local populations, they don't have access to enough information to have the full picture as to what is going on. They scream about the West and the Alkebu-lan and the Ab.Zu, and we're like, no. East out, West has to get out too. International banksters got our folks in the Alkebu-lan and the Ab.Zu upside down by their toenails. The same way they have most like and kindred in North-Amexem, Central and South-Amexem upside down by their toenails. It's just they have it done differently. Both sides, our folks are jacked up in the head. They're attacked differently on the other side. Same outcome. Jacked up in the head. In the Alkebu-lan and the Ab.Zu, in many ways, it can be worse. Over here, there's broader access to information. Over there, not so much. They're working overtime to put things into place on the other side of the ocean to basically dig their talons in deeper, to dig their claws in deeper, in terms of having a grip on the brain of our folks. Control the brain on both sides of the ocean of the melanated heterosexuals, and you got their land and labor by default. Program them to think how you want them to think. In other words, merely educate them. Program them. Do not allow them to become learned. That's their mission. knowing how to think for yourself, being learned, they don't want that. It runs counter to their plans. Kith and kindred have no idea. So when the Russians invaded Ukraine, most of the population in the Alkebu-lan and Ab.Zu, they sided with the Russians. If you ask them, did you know that the bulk of your grains that keep the cost of grains and other foods low all throughout the Alkebu-lan and the Ab.Zu, they come from Ukraine? Did you know the bulk of your fertilizer comes from Ukraine? The bulk of the continent population does not know this. So what do? They side with the Russians against their own best interests. Now, if they had greater access to information, you would say, are you idiots, high, drunk, or stupid to go against your own interest? The bulk of them, though, don't have access to information like that. They have no idea. All they know is a year and a half into that conflict, and they were screaming because they couldn't afford the fertilizer. We don't use it anyway, but they do. They couldn't afford the food prices because the grains had gone up so high. The corn, or as they call it, maize, had cost so much. Why is this happening? Because their supply got invaded by the Russians. And you took the Russian side. And they're sending folks from the mother continent, from Alkebu-lan and the Ab.Zu, to go fight for the Russians against Ukraine right now. Against their own best interests. We're neither pro or con either side. We're neutral. However, 2 plus 2 literally equals 4. If your supplier of your fertilizer and the supplier of the grains that you're importing is under attack, then what they would generally supply to you, they can no longer supply. Supply goes down, but demand did not. Prices are going to go up. 2 plus 2 equals 4. It is not hard. In the Sahel, you had these idiots get suckered in Bamako. They talked to the Algerians and said, hey, we're going to do this coup. Will you back us up? They said, yes. We'll support you if you go in. They moved to kick the Franks and Gauls out of Bamako. Paris jumped all over the Algerians who got cold feet and left them hanging. The idiots in Bamako, the new junta, don't know their head from their elbow, and they needed help to maintain. So what do? They make a deal. Why? Because they can't get weapons. Then kick the Franks and Gauls out, and no one will quote unquote sell them weapons. You know who'll sell them? Moscow, the arms supplier. Here's the deal. You let us refine the gold for you. We keep 25% of the gold profits. We'll send in our PMCs, private military contractors, whether it be Wagner or Africorps, and we will dominate the areas where your gold is. But of course, the Russians couldn't leave it at that. They got to storm all over Mali Beni Waris. And Bamako, the junta let them. The Tuareg Moors were like, yo, what are y'all doing over here in our turf? Why are you here? Go home. They want to dominate that particular area. And the Tuareg Moors said, no. So, the Ukrainians told the Tuareg Moors who the Russians were in Azawad, in the Mali Beni Waris. Because the Russian PMCs killed some of the Tuaregs and killed someone that was prominent, or the family of someone that was prominent. You rankled the locals, and the locals responded. Ukrainians told them where the Russians were, and they handled their business. And then Ukrainians told them where some more Russians were, and the Tuareg Moors handled their business again. That caused Bamako and 6 other places in Alkebu-lan and Ab-Zu to kick out the Ukrainians and send them home, because the Russians did not like that. The same deal that Bamako made, the junta in Niamey made, the same deal was made by the junta under Traore in Ouagadougou. Conakry didn't make that deal. The first to make the deal, though, was not Bamako, was not Niamey, was not Ouagadougou. The first to make that deal was Tubangui. Tudor made that deal. Not for gold, though. Diamonds. And Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, PMC, from Russia, and just under 3 Earth years became a billionaire from all the diamonds that he was getting out from Tubangui. And if he got that, what do you think made it into the treasury? Because if he was getting that kind of funds, you know that the leader in Moscow got his cut, and a portion went into their treasury. In other words, they're funding their conflict with Ukraine. Not our business. What is our business is the siphoning of those resources. So in the Sahel, Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou kicked out the Franks and Gauls. Great. But you bring in Moscow? Well, we needed to bring them in to help us refine the gold. My response is, you did not. They refined gold in Accra. They refined gold in, quote-unquote, Jayberg, in Azania. You could ask our brothers and sisters how to do that. You can pay them to train you, and then you do it yourself, instead of handle with 25% of the profit that you could be using for other things. I'm not going to argue with the progress that they have made. Niamey paid off the entire national debt. I ain't mad. Same thing was done by Traore in Ouagadougou, and a few other things of note. I'm not mad at them. Not for that. I fundamentally disagree on how they pay for it. By being default puppets of Moscow. So when DC so-called threatened Traore, he runs to Moscow a couple months back. Again, folks don't pay attention, they don't listen, can't tell them nothing, and they don't learn. Like Traore, did you not learn from Assad? Did you not learn from what happened in Tehran? Tehran's getting bombed, and Moscow was silent until after the bombs basically stopped falling. They kept their mouths shut. Meanwhile, Tehran helped them out big time, providing them with the Shahed drones and a host of other technologies, and a host of other things, artillery rounds and things of this nature. Not many, but they did provide them with some. Tehran's helping them out against Ukraine. But when so-called Tel Aviv came at the Tehran, Moscow was silent. And then those who left from Tehran to go to Moscow had to hand over gold after they got that plane. So you want to come here and gain quote-unquote residency? We'll let you stay. Gonna cost some gold though. Hand it over. And they did. So you want to depend on Moscow to back you up when they can't even handle Ukraine? Over 1 million casualties against someone whose population is way smaller, whose military is way smaller, who literally was running out of artillery rounds, and they surpassed everyone's expectations because they said, we're not going to be using artillery that we don't have. They started using drones made in folks' garages. And the drones have a higher accuracy rate. They cost less than the artillery rounds and the artillery period. and the maintenance of the artillery, and they're far more accurate. And now, almost 80% of the casualties on both sides now are by drones. Warfare, as folks know it, has changed. Our kith and kindred in the Sahel have learned nothing. They are buying weapons out of the remaining 75% of the profits from the gold that they trade out. They are buying weapons with that. The Russians are slowing down their deliveries because they need everything that they produce, because the Ukrainians are giving it to them. They're giving them some nasty work. Filthy. They are catching some serious hands. You would have thought this would have been over in a few Earth days. It's been over. It's going to be 4 years. 4 full years, and very soon. You couldn't beat up on small little Ukraine after all this time? Russia is that weak. So, the only other option they have is to buy the weapons from Beyjing. Beijing's weapons are trash. Ask Dhaka in Bangladesh. Ask them over in Abuja. Kingdom of Siam turned down Chinese aircraft, so-called Chinese aircraft, for their air force. They're buying from the Swedes. They're buying the Gripen. Even the default colony, Islamabad, said no thanks for their frigates and their corvettes. They're buying them from Ankara. So as I said before, what you're seeing happening now is Ankara is ascending as weapon supplier, and so is Seoul. Who's the big loser here? Beijing. They can't give their weapons away, so they're literally attempting to give their weapon, one of their stealth fighters, their air force is not even flying themselves, and there's a stealth carrier jet that they're not even using themselves. They want to provide both of these to Islamabad and make them the guinea pigs. Give it to them for half off, let them make payments, and the payments are deferred. That's how desperate they are to get in on this. It's not so much for Islamabad per se. This is one very long brochure, one very long perspective, one very long commercial. They can make it work through the efforts of the Islamabad Air Force. They want to make moves. Beijing wants to make moves to get the monarchies in the Gulf to buy their aircraft. And they don't want to do that either. If they don't buy from so-called DC or get the Rafale from Paris, they're going to get their aircraft from Ankara. And why is that, some would say? Because of how they think in Beijing. The Muslims in Western so-called China are heavily marginalized. Some get sterilized, some have their internal organs taken and quote-unquote sold on the market. They're Muslims. And the Sunnis didn't forget that. It ain't what folks think it is. Beijing would like to have some influence in northeast Alkebu-lan, misnomer quote-unquote Middle East. And they're losing their grip. So when so-called Tel Aviv went and bombed all over Tehran, and when so-called DC came in and dog-walked them, whether they took out particular targets is not the point. What is the point is they basically told Beijing to their face, we can dog walk all of your default colonies because we dog walk your tech. which means if we want you, we would dog walk you all over your capital of Beijing. They got the message, and they settled up on the deal. Why do y'all think that is? Beijing was never going to win the tariff conflict. I said it over and over and over. If you are the producer of the product, you don't have the leverage you think you have. If you're the manufacturer on the planet for a whole lot of stuff, if folks don't want to buy, whatever you manufacture is irrelevant. And folks they're onshoring or nearshoring production of things that they used to come to you for. Your labor force is not getting any younger. The average median lifetime frame is 53 years. In other words, they have more folks in their 50s in Beijing than they have in their 40s, 30s, and 20s. So their labor is fading because they're becoming more senior and they have less offspring. So that does not allow them to keep their wages suppressed for so long. That was their biggest advantage. The infrastructure is under constant attack because their engineering and their their architect work and their construction is shoddy. They call it tofu dreg. The buildings are horrible. The bridges collapse if you breathe on them. A couple little floods here and there, and the bridges left and right have been collapsing. This is all recent. So I'm going to say it again. Beijing is not the next global superpower. Europe is basically done. Because like Beijing, they are seeing themselves more and more elderly, especially Deutschland, especially Roma, Central Europe, Southern Europe, Northern in the Baltics. They're not getting any younger in their population. All across this planet, more Caucasians are passed away than have become made manifest. Their population is decreasing all across the planet. The population density is changing as a consequence. Hegemony all across the planet by the colonizing hostiles is gradually coming to a close. Yes, the Davos clowns. Yes, the international banksters, Larry Fink and the rest of BlackRock. Yes, all these folks over there at the Rockefeller owned and operated quote-unquote United Nations with their World Bank and their WHO. Then there's the IMF. Then there's the Rockefeller-controlled AU, so-called African Union. And then there's CARICOM. And all of them are they're all going nowhere fast and on their way out. The scourge of democracy is going out with it. It is what it is. And it can't be what it's not. And most of our folks, they don't pay attention. They got short attention spans. They don't read. They don't investigate. All they do is merely research. You can't tell them nothing. And they don't learn. Time is coming upon everyone on this planet now, and they're going to learn today. Folks are going to either pay attention or get swept up. Some are going to catch on and say, I better do better. I better figure it out right now.